Germany has the plan to phase out coal by 2038. But now we have a more ambitious European climate target. And of course, the European emission trading system will be adjusted. And that will mean that Germany will probably have to phase out coal by 2030, so much earlier. So the European Green Deal, in terms of targets, will definitely have a very strong effect on the whole German targets and, of course, also on the measures to achieve these targets.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hans Koenig. I lead the consulting business of Aurora in Central Europe. I'm joined today by Dr. Brigitte Knopf. Welcome, Brigitte.
Hello.
So, a short introduction before we get into the content. Brigitte is one of Germany's leading experts on climate change and what can be done to stop it. She works in energy and climate policy in general, but especially focuses on Germany and Europe. Her main job is being Secretary General of the MCC, the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, which is quite a mouthful, so we mostly say MCC in Germany. And the MCC is a leading think tank on the economics of climate change based here in Berlin. Prior to joining the MCC 6 years ago, she also spent several years at PIC, the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research, where she also did her PhD in physics. Besides that, she served on numerous expert and advisory panels and was most recently appointed the deputy chair of the German government's Council of Experts on Climate Change, which will be the focus of our discussion today because they very recently issued their first report. And as if all that weren't enough, we're also very happy to have Brigitte as a member of Aurora's German advisory board. So really an extremely qualified person to have on the podcast, and we're very happy you could find the time. Welcome, Brigitte.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hans, for this very nice introduction.
Great. So before we get into the content, we like having a bit of a discussion about the personal backgrounds of our guests. So to start off with, maybe talk a little bit even about your undergraduate studies, because even then you focused on solar energy, or especially the physics of solar energy. Would the 20-year-old you have been surprised to find out where you have gotten now?
Yes, I think definitely, because I never thought of staying in academia. I was a bit more on the practitioner side. In my diploma thesis, I investigated and partly invented a storage for solar thermal plants for hot water. So it was more on the practitioner side. So therefore, and staying in academia, that was nothing I could think of before. I mean, on the other hand, I was always interested in environment, that interested me from the very beginning onwards, and also in politics, right? So, and now I have the feeling that I've combined both sides. So climate is more than environment, but still on that part. And the other part, the political part and being a kind of advisor and being in this kind of process of scientific policy advice. So that's really an interesting position, but I couldn't have thought about it 30 years ago.
Interesting. And what made you go back? Because actually, after your studies, you, if I recall correctly, you worked for a solar thermal company for a couple of years in R&D, but then went back to do your PhD, right?
Exactly, that was my experience. I was in this R&D department of a new company, a startup that was quite interesting. But it was of course, the aim of the company to sell their products and to convince people not to buy the other products from other companies. And I thought, well, it doesn't matter to me which kind of products they buy. I would like to see overall progress in solar thermal power plants or solar PV or whatever. So therefore, I then thought, I saw a job ad for the Potsdam Institute for making a PhD in physics, and I thought, well, perhaps this is a better place to be for me.
Okay, so your interest was less in the kind of the competition between one company and another, but rather kind of the system as a whole, which then I guess led you to systems modeling and all the work you've done in the past 20 years.
Exactly. I wanted to understand the physics behind it and also the physics of climate change. So that was more or less the broader topic of my PhD thesis.
Very interesting. Thanks. And obviously now you're at MCC, which is one of the really influential voices in the German, but also the wider climate policy debate. How do you view your role and your institution's role in all this?
Yeah, so our aim at MCC is really to combine two strands here. And one is excellency in academia, in economics and social sciences on the climate issue, right? So it's another direction, not physics, but more economics. And on the other hand, we want to provide scientific policy advice, so to be policy relevant. And that's not always easy to combine, right? Because if you want to provide excellent research results, you have to publish in peer-reviewed publications and so on, peer-reviewed journals. And on the other hand, to be policy relevant sometimes requires to be very fast and provide short-term advice. But this is the aim we have at MCC, and I think we are doing quite a good job there.
And I guess one of the key challenges you've mentioned pace and being providing advice quickly when it is needed. Another challenge, at least that we at Aurora come across quite a lot, is simplification, right? Because you have all these complex models, and of course, climate models are probably still much more complex than kind of the energy systems models we are working at, and you then get policymakers expecting you to give fairly clear and kind of yes, no, ABC style answers. Are there any lessons you have drawn from doing that for almost 2 decades now, which you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, perhaps a few observations. So on the one hand, I would agree that policymakers always want a very clear answer. They want one number and they want a direction. And we try to step back from this a little bit, because when you are a modeler, you know that there are different assumptions behind it and different pathways that you can pursue. This is our approach for scientific policy advice, that we want to lay out different options, because it very much depends on the assumptions you have, which pathway you want to follow. So let's make a very simple example. For the energy transition, you can fully go for renewables, or you say, well, nuclear also plays an important role in that portfolio. Or you could say, okay, I want to continue with coal, but then I need negative emissions and carbon capture and storage. These are very different pathways. And we want to lay open the underlying assumptions of these pathways. What are the implicit assumptions of that? And what are the underlying costs and risks? And this is our approach in scientific policy advice, not to give one direction, but really showing the options and sometimes implicit normative values that are also behind it. Policymakers do not always like that. That's also very difficult to communicate. But on the other hand, sometimes they see the benefit of that because, in the end, it's the policymaker's choice, and he or she has to implement the options and also discuss it with the voters. So therefore, I think more and more this kind of approach is being acknowledged to think more in options.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and it's something we're trying to do at Aurora. But it's of course sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder, sometimes people are more receptive to it, sometimes less. But so it's continuous work in progress. But yeah, really important point. I'd like to talk to you about the Council of Experts on Climate Change, of which you are the vice chair. But before we get into the details there, could you, for the perhaps 80 to 90% of our listeners who are not that familiar with German climate policy, give us an introduction on what the Council of Experts is and why it was established?
Yeah, perhaps I start back in 2019, because in that year there was a big debate in Germany. It was quite clear that we do not meet our European targets that we have for the sectors like transport and buildings. There was also some dynamics from the Fridays for Future movement, who called for more ambitious targets and more ambitious climate policy in Germany. And there was a whole process during that year in 2019. And the government came up with a whole package, the whole climate package it was called, in September 2019. Mm-hmm. And during this process, or one outcome of this process was that this Federal Climate Change Act was adopted. So you could say in brief, a climate law was adopted. And the core of this climate law, of this Climate Change Act, is that there are yearly sectoral targets. So sectoral targets for transport, for buildings, for land use, and so on, also for energy and industry. There is a process attached to that, a kind of review mechanism, whether Germany keeps to its own targets. And the role of this Council of Experts on Climate Change is to monitor whether the targets are met, to also review the emission data. And if the targets are not met, then the according ministry has to put an immediate action program on the table. And then the second step is that we, as the Council of Experts, also check the assumptions of that program. So these are the two main parts where the expert council comes into play in this whole climate law in Germany. And also important, the German parliament can also request a report from the council. I mean, this has not been done yet because we were formally installed half a year ago, and we now published our first report in April last week. But this is the overall mechanism where the council comes into play, and this is the major role to somehow monitor and control this kind of climate law with these yearly sectoral targets.
Obviously, as you mentioned, the sectoral targets are a very important part of the logic of how German climate change or climate policy works. And this is something that, at least kind of among economists, is quite controversial, because you would get a lot of mainstream economists. Their answer would be, okay, just have a carbon price or have a carbon trading scheme, cover all sectors, job done. No need for sectoral targets, and they're just going to make things expensive. How do you view that? Is it really an imperfect solution we have to accept because of how politics works, or do you see some more fundamental virtues in these sectoral targets which Germany has set itself?
Well, I clearly see a trade-off. I mean, I would fully agree with what you said, that we have to think more cross-sectoral wide, especially when we think of electrification, because then we have a shift from the transport sector more to the energy sector again. So from an economic point of view, this doesn't make too much sense. But from a political point of view, I mean, the problem in Germany was that it was always the environmental ministry who said, well, we have to increase the targets, we have to do better, and so on. And they always felt the duty to deliver the targets, but they did not get the hand on the really core issues like the transport sector. And so therefore, I mean, this was then the political idea behind it, to make the other ministries and ministers also responsible to deliver for the climate issue. And this is the idea behind. So yeah, I would say it's really kind of trade-off between economic efficiency and then political economy behind it to deliver the targets.
So if the environmental ministry can't get responsibility for decarbonizing transportation, at least you can make the transport ministry responsible for doing that and make sure they do something about it. That kind of thinking.
Exactly. I mean, it's very clearly in the law that they have to deliver this immediate action program then, and that this has to be laid on the table and being presented. So indeed, I think what really changed now is, I mean, Germany focused a long time just on the electricity sector. And now it becomes clear, I mean, we're going towards carbon neutrality by 2050. So now it's really clear that every sector has to deliver. So therefore, I would think that perhaps this approach with these sectoral targets is, I see it more in the time span, like a sequencing approach, right? It's important to go on with that for, let's say, another 5-6 years or so, but then to open again the perspective more towards a cross-sectoral, fully integrated approach.
To continue on the role of the Council of Experts, it is sometimes compared to the British Climate Change Committee, or the formerly Committee on Climate Change. Can you tell us a bit about what the similarities and what the differences to the CCC are?
I would say it's completely different. I mean, these are two independent bodies, right? Scientific bodies. This is perhaps the common approach, but the mandate is very, very different. I mean, the UK Climate Change Committee was the first one to be installed, and they have a very broad mandate. They have a forward-looking mandate. They can suggest the carbon budget for some years ahead. I think this is very important to have a view on the future. And they also can make proposals on policy measures. These are two very important ingredients of this council, I would say. And in Germany, as I said before, so our Council of Experts has a more limited mandate. It's rather looking back a little bit, or looking at that immediate year that we have, checking assumptions, checking data. So it's much more limited than of course the UK Climate Change Committee.
I guess that begs the question: do you think the Council of Experts should be more like the CCC? Should you have more forward-looking competencies as well?
At least I think it's very important to have that kind of scientific advice on more forward-looking issues. It's also within the climate law in Germany that there is a forward-looking process. It's a different track, right? It's not with the mandate of the Experts Council here. There are other groups in Germany, other councils that have a more forward-looking mandate. And so for me, I think also for the next legislation, it would be important to somehow coordinate among these different councils to come up with a more stronger advice that is useful for policymakers.
Yeah, very good point. So you've just published your first report assessing Germany's emissions in 2020, and I had a look at it preparing for this podcast, obviously, and it's a very impressive piece of work, 140 pages in total, and you only had 1 month to do all that. What was it like to work on it, and are there any lessons you learned from this process for next year's report?
Yeah, it was very interesting because it was really for the first time for all of us, but also for the ministries. So, I mean, it was very important for us to put a report on the table that is really quite mature and that has some important messages, right? We put a twofold focus on this report, I would say. So on the one hand, we really had a deeper dive into the mechanism of this climate law and how is it really working and what does it mean and are there some pitfalls? Yes, there are. We identified them and made suggestions for improvement. And the second point was, or second focus, I would say, was, I mean, the year 2020 was, of course, special because we had the corona pandemic. and emissions were really very much triggered by that effect or affected by that effect of the corona crisis and the measures to for example, with the lockdown and so on. So therefore, we tried to identify the effect of these measures. What does it mean in terms of emission reduction? What does it mean in the transport sector? And that was quite interesting because we could really figure out how much of the emission reduction was due to the lockdown. So to say it's not just the emission reduction in Germany. I mean, we had a strong emission reduction, of course, that year, but it's not due to structural change, but part of it, at least part of it, or a large part of it goes back to these, for example, the corona effects.
Absolutely, and I found it really helpful to have this kind of this transparency provided about how much is structural, how much can we expect to be a one-off, which I guess takes us to the substance of the report. And before we get into it, can you introduce our non-German listeners to where Germany stands when it comes to decarbonization?
Yeah, I mean, I would say Germany has for a long time very much focused on the expansion of renewables and less on phasing out coal, for example, and less on economic instruments. Also, compared to the UK, for example, it has perceived itself as kind of front runner for quite a long time, but I would say it has lost this position over time. And that also became clear in 2019 that, emissions are not decreasing as fast as expected, and coal was still on the table. And it's also clear that now the 2030 targets in Germany won't be met by the measures that are already taken. So Germany is not the front runner anymore. We have decided to phase out nuclear, that's long ago. We also have decided to phase out coal, but only in 2038. For some, that's still a very long time. Yeah, and I would say it's also important to have additional measures because the current 2030 targets are not yet met.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I were to paraphrase, things aren't going great, but at least, or perhaps they're not going as badly as they did a couple of years ago. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think politics has now recognized that there is a problem. And before, there was always this kind of narrative, Germany is the provider of solar PV and so on. I mean, what's somehow correct, that's right. But as I said, I mean, you also have to understand that coal is competing with the renewables. And coal was so cheap at that time that partly emissions increased again. So yeah, therefore, I would say now we are in the process of getting on track again.
Okay, well, that's promising. So let's focus on the report. What would you say are the most important findings that come out of it?
Yeah, I would start with a kind of we have 3 pillars or 3 parts, and all the 3 parts are important in itself, but perhaps for different audiences. The first part is the evaluation of the data that is provided by the environmental agency in Germany. This is probably not so interesting for the broader audience, but it's important to have that kind of review and that the data are really being assessed. That's important to give credibility to the data when we think of talking to the other ministries, when the environmental ministry talks to the other ministries. So this is the basis for the debate, right? It's probably for the broader audience not so important. What I think it's really interesting for the broader audience is really that we try to get a picture of the corona effect. We have to summarize all the special effects that we have in 2020. It's very, very methodologically very difficult to really identify the single corona effect. This is not possible. But here, one interesting finding is that overall, when you look at the data, the building sector has failed to meet its targets. But when we account for the additional effect that we had in 2020 due to the corona crisis, it becomes clear that the building sector would have met its target, but not the transport sector. The transport sector is 10% above, or would have been 10% above its target when there was no corona. So this is a very important finding, because this shows you that we need a more broader picture, not just to focus on this 1 year, but we need a broader picture in terms of structural changes. And the third part is then suggestions for the improvement of this Federal Change Act and the whole mechanism. Again, this is more perhaps dedicated to the policymakers who are involved in this process, not so much for the broader audience, but also important because, I mean, this climate law is new, and there could be some improvements.
Thank you. I think the point you make about this short-term focus is a really important one, because if I understand it correctly, the only reason the transport sector doesn't have to, or the transport ministry now doesn't have to prepare a program for what they can do to further lower emissions in the transport sector, is corona, so there's nothing structural about it. So in a way, this is something from which other countries can learn, that perhaps a too short-term and too sectoral approach isn't sensible when it comes to long-term decarbonization.
Exactly. I mean, this is really the problem, and here, I mean, in all the other sectors, it's much more difficult to single out this corona effect. But in the transport sector, we made an additional analysis, and you can really detect and attribute these lockdown phases to the emissions. And here we have a very clear picture of what happened. The emissions in the transport sector would be 10% higher. So therefore, we really have a clear number. And I think what this shows is that you need to look a little bit more into the future. Perhaps not until 2030, because then a lot of additional assumptions come in, and it's always very difficult how will GDP develop and so on. But to have a look for the next 1 or 2 years, that would be quite important. So therefore, our suggestion is, in the climate law, they say when a target is not met in this sector, then the ministry has to propose an immediate action program. And what we say is we need an additional mechanism also for those sectors who meet their target, but where we see some structural problems or when uncertainties come into play. And we say that there should be a second kind of checkup mechanism to see whether also when the target is being met, whether some additional measures are required.
So yeah, very good point. And I guess that's on your personal but also on the council's wish list as Germany enters the campaigning season for the parliamentary elections in fall. Like, are there any other climate and or council related items on your wish list for the electoral campaigns?
Yeah, my personal wish list is really that ideal would be a whole of government approach for Germany, right? So perhaps similar to the US. And I think Germany also started with that, because in 2019, Chancellor Merkel invented the so-called climate cabinet. And she put together all the 6 ministries who are somehow involved in the climate issue, from buildings, agriculture, transport, and so on. And this is not just the climate cabinet, but also the state secretaries are involved in that. And so there are different layers, you could say, from different levels in the ministries involved. And I would strongly suggest to continue with that kind of approach, because some now call for our own climate ministry, but I would not go for that. I would say it's rather it's important to have a mainstreaming approach of this climate issue, and this climate cabinet approach, I think it wasn't too bad. So I would continue with that one.
That's a really good point, and it reminds me of a discussion that that always comes up in the topic of digital transformation of everything. I mean, you get people calling for a ministry for digital affairs or for digitalization, and I think it kind of misses the point, because everything needs to go digital, and just as everything needs to go climate neutral. So setting up a separate ministry to kind of take care of that. Well, you would kind of create a ministry of ministries. So you might as well keep the original ministries and make them really commit to net zero emissions, right?
Exactly. So therefore, I think we need a cross-ministerial approach, and I think the climate cabinet is a way to go forward.
Interesting. Thank you. So before we get to the end of the podcast, I would like to take it a bit to the European level, which of course also features in your report. What does the tightening of European targets under the European Green Deal mean for Germany?
Yeah, very certainly the pathway towards 2030 will be more ambitious, or has to become more ambitious. It's still the question whether this will lead to more ambitious sectoral targets in Germany. It might also be covered by the European governance mechanism. But in the end, of course, Germany has to deliver a quite more ambitious pathway. That's quite clear. Currently, Germany has a target of 55% until 2030 compared to 1990. And we made estimates that this pathway has to change towards 62 to 68%. So medium 65%, that would mean an additional 10 percentage points more than we currently have. And the question is, what is happening at the European level? I mean, many things are being discussed, whether the effort sharing regulation will be adjusted, whether we will have more ambitious national targets, or whether we will see a second emission trading system for buildings and transport at the European level. So this depends very much. But what I think one thing is very clear, I said before that Germany has the plan to phase out coal by 2038. But now we have a more ambitious European climate target. And of course, the European emission trading system will be adjusted. And that will mean that Germany will probably have to phase out coal by 2030, so much earlier. So the European Green Deal, in terms of targets, will definitely have a very strong effect on the whole German targets, and of course also on the measures to achieve these targets.
I mean, it's an interesting point. So I agree. If the European Green Deal comes, the German coal exit compromise would be mute. In your view, does that mean that the Coal Commission and this whole process we went through wasn't necessary, or do you think? I mean, you do get people saying that the European Green Deal is only possible because the issue of German coal has been solved, and you don't have kind of the combined forces of the German energy industry and German industry running against the European Green Deal to protect German coal.
I would agree that it's more the latter case. So with the Coal Commission, that somehow prepared the way that Germany is able to agree on a higher EU target. I think this is now quite clear. It's more a political economy argument, but without the coal compromise, I don't think that Germany could have agreed on this higher EU target. And concerning coal, I mean, I was also skeptical with the Coal Commission a little bit, and I wished for a more economic approach, for example, with a additional carbon floor price in addition to the EU ETS price at the national scale, as the UK did. But in the end, I think it was the German way to do that. And the major part of the money goes to the coal regions. And it's because there needs to be kind of structural change, and they need support for the coal regions. And this is the bulk of the money. And this has to be paid anyway. right? Because we need these people also need to be supported. So therefore, I think in the end, the coal compromise was okay because it's now a common sense in Germany. It's a consensus. With the Green Deal, we will now see an earlier phase out, but I think everybody is aware of that. And we have already this supporting mechanism for the coal mining regions that we have already installed through the coal compromise.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I think there is a question whether the regions that definitely do need support would have been in as good a negotiating position without a coal commission, and would have gotten just as much in a similar format. But of course, it doesn't change anything about the fundamental need to do something and about the regions and to provide new good jobs there, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we have to watch whether this money is really given for the right things, right? Is it really supporting people in the coal mining regions? Is it really supporting structural change? Or where does the money go? And I think it's very important to track where this coal region money goes in Germany.
Absolutely. So one of the things that the European Green Deal will also bring is a European scientific advisory board on climate change, which has similarities to both the CCC in Britain and the German Council of Experts. Based on your experience, what would be your advice to the European institutions as they set up this advisory board?
I would say the guiding idea should be along the lines of the UK Climate Change Committee. It's a very strong committee. What I also find interesting that it's being chaired by a person who's not a scientist, but it's a person who has the political credibility. I think that's very important also to be able to talk to the policymakers and to know their constraints. So therefore, ingredients would be also to have some forward-looking elements in the mandate, and also a mandate to suggest policy measures. I think this is really important in the whole process.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This has been a really interesting conversation about the role of experts and how they advise political decision makers. Before we close, we like taking our guests through a couple of concepts in the energy transition and ask them for their opinion whether they are overrated or underrated. You can make this an overrated or underrated one-word answer, or you can add 1 or 2 sentences of explanation, but please not much more than that. We'd really like to get your unfiltered opinion, as it were. The first concept I brought today is the role of markets in the energy transition.
Overrated and underrated at the same time. Underrated in reality and overrated in theory.
Interesting. The second would be negative emissions technologies.
Clearly underrated, because they will become much more important when we take 1.5 degree seriously.
Thank you. Thirdly, models to analyze the future of energy systems.
Overrated. I once was a modeler myself, and I know how sensitive they are. So for me, they are no more a tool to facilitate the discussion about future pathways.
Very good. And fourthly and finally, Germany's image as a driver of the global energy transition.
Overrated, but in history, Germany was really a driver of solar PV, and I think that made solar PV very cheap for the whole world.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us today. It was a real pleasure to talk to you, and all the best, and hopefully let's catch up soon.
Thank you, Hans.
That was Hans Koenig, who leads the consulting business of Aurora in Central Europe, talking to Brigitte Knopf, the Secretary General of the MCC. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.